So you all read this text. I'm curious to see what your responses to it were in the discussion period. But what I appreciate about Dave Chicarico's work on this is that he takes it seriously as a work of fiction. He spends time thinking about how these various movements are occurring, how the text compels us to reread it in order to contextualize and to incorporate the new elements that the page is offering us. But he also notices that there are many references to James Joyce's Ulysses. One of the key ones is the title, which comes from an anti-Semitic ballad that gets sung, in that novel. Dave actually took the time to figure out which version of that ballad, which goes back to the English 13th century, Joyce was using to understand what Morrissey was thinking about as he put this together. You know that the narrator, the protagonist of this story, represents himself as a Jewish person of Irish descent. So his identity is connected in some way with the title. He also walks a lot, and Dave points out that Ulysses is about a walk. It's about Bloom walking around Dublin. So another link. At one point in the story, the narrator goes to the library looking for a biography, and Dave assumes or guesses that the biography is the biography of Joyce. And he makes these connections to Joyce's novel. So looking for intertextuality. He also applies the principles of narratology. He says, who is the narrator of this text? How do we identify the narrator? And he notices that it's a first-person homodiegetic narrator in most cases. We identify with this young student who's anxious about his girlfriend having an affair. But he notices too that at points, the discourse shifts to other characters who seem to be speaking from their own perspectives. And Dave doesn't say this, but in talking to Dave, I've said, I think Morrissey is engaging with what Virginia Woolf in her novel, Mrs. Dalloway, calls tunneling, moving from the perspective of one character into the perspective of another linked character. And then finally, both Dave and I agree that this probably, for some of you, irritatingly recursive dimension of this text, you have to reread it and reread it and reread it, does two things. It reproduces the effect of walking around the city, maybe every day, seeing the same things, but thinking about them a little bit differently. So that recursive dimension of walking in a city. But it also represents obsessive thoughts of thinking about, is my girlfriend having an affair? Is she unfaithful to me? And when we have obsessive thoughts like that, we go back over them again and again and again. So the version of hypertextuality that Judd uses here may well reproduce the thought processes of the narrator as well as representing his day-to-day experiences. So thinking about how the way the text behaves might be connected with what the text is saying, the story the text is telling, the message the text is trying to convey to us, is one of the ways we can pay attention responsibly and critically to what these texts are doing. As I said, I think Dave's work is one of the best works of criticism. I think The Jew's Daughter remains one of the best works, most interesting works of electronic literature out there. And it's wonderful that we've developed Flash emulators that allow us to keep reading it. You wouldn't have been able to read this. I'm curious about what emulator you used if that effort for preservation hadn't taken place. So very quickly here, I'm going to move to three other examples. First is The Dream Life of Letters by another kind of major poet of electronic literature, Brian Kim Steffens. And I'll just show this really quickly. It's an example of text animation that I think is worth thinking about in terms of how do we contextualize these unusual texts within a sort of deep history of literature. So I'm just going to run the poem and skip the introduction. So I'll just play a short bit of this and just get a sense of how it works. So Brian is very interested in concrete poetry. So he's using some of the techniques that the Campos brothers developed in the 1950s to make images out of poems, to pull the typographical dimension of a poem into the meaning of the poem. Some of them are quite simple, they're kind of like one-off jokes. Some of them are pretty sophisticated. But Brian is also interested in the movement called Lettrisme, so Brian is tapping into those avant-garde literary movements and employing their techniques, taking on their aesthetics, making use of animated text, of the capacities of Flash in this case, to make text move and to make those movements meaningful in ways that we have to work to interpret. So that's The Dream Life of Letters, Brian Kim Steffens. Another text that's been preserved, able to read because of Flash emulators. A particularly, that was my timer. Particularly dramatic and expensive way of creating electronic literature is a three-dimensional platform called The Cave, which is located at Brown University in Rhode Island. And I've been lucky enough to be in The Cave and get a sense of the immersive textual experience The Cave makes possible. I'm going to play just a little bit of this film of a work that was created for The Cave to give you a sense of the real kind of limit case, the really extreme version of electronic literature that's being developed now. And this is the one that has to do with translation. So I'll play it. So I'm going to just play it from the beginning.
It was a project conducted under the rubric of a Fulbright Tech Impact Award at the Department of Literary Arts, Brown University. The Rubaiyat used Brown University's interactive and immersive stereo 3D audio-visual environment, also known as The Cave, to make a digitally mediated work of poetic language art, while at the same time studying The Cave as a media system for digital literary practice.
This is both an artistic and a critical
project.
I think that's
used
important
The Cave
to think
to
about.
explore notions of translation, multiculturalism, and the impact of technological affordances on literary expression and reception. A digital version of the poem, The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, was created, one that allowed the user to experience simultaneously different translations that exist for this work. Potentially, this provides the reader with an opportunity to gain equal access to alternative versions, some of which may fall outside the mainstream. For example, the Digital Cave version not only includes the well-known translation by Edward Fitzgerald, but also an unknown version by a Mrs. H.M. Caldwell, a Persian scholar who dedicated her life to the translation and study of the Persian language. The audio for the piece used the singer Kulthum's rendition of the Egyptian poet Ahmed Rami's translation of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. An Irish language version is also used, as this is intended to represent the research.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there. An immersive experience of text, but also one that's thinking about the relationship among translations of the same text, and thinking about also, the critic's own position in relation to Janine Naji's cultural background. So I really want to encourage students, faculty to take on the challenge of writing about these texts using all the equipment that we have as literary critics, from our training in more conventional literature. So the last example I want to pull before I talk a little bit about my own is a work that was published, was released as an app for mobile devices in 2017. It was created by the media group, The Pixel Hunt, in collaboration with another media group in France called FIGS. It's called Bury Me, My Love. Some of you may recognize that as an expression in Arabic. But what I find kind of astonishing about this work, and I've taught it a couple of times, and students find it quite remarkable as well, it works through a text messaging. It replicates a text messaging exchange between a couple, one of whom, Noor, is escaping from Syria, trying to seek asylum in Europe. And we follow her journey as her husband is still in Syria, taking care of his family. And the story progresses through the text messages they're exchanging. And you, as the reader, have the opportunity to, sorry, just lost it. Great. To respond to the texts that her husband is sending her. You play the role of her husband sending her these texts. It includes screen photographs of the things that Noor is seeing, and also photographs from her husband back in Syria. The striking thing about the way this text works, there's her husband, or maps as well, is that it's time-based. So you can play it, either just read it through on your own time, or you can set it so that there are delays in Noor's messages coming back to you. So you don't know what's happening to her while you're waiting for her message. There are 19 different ways this story can end. In some of them, she successfully gets to Europe. Some of them, she dies. In one of them, she divorces her husband when she gets to Europe. So 19 different ways the story can end based on the choices you make as a reader, the messages that you send to Noor in your role as her husband. So that's an example, I think, of the moral, ethical dimensions of the choices these texts make us make. But also the kind of excitement that they can cause. Some of my students couldn't tolerate the wait, so they switched back to the controlled reading version of this text. But that's, I think, one of the most striking recent examples of a work of electronic literature that really captures the conventions of text messaging, in this case, a contemporary technology, to tell a really compelling and really topical story. So in the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to say a little bit about this work I wrote in 2004. It was published first in a journal that's now defunct called the Iowa Review Web, and later it was taken up in the electronic literature collection. And it's one of the texts that they've been able to preserve. So I'm very grateful that people can continue to read it. So as I said, I worked as a waiter in a hotel in Waikiki. I was in the labor union at the hotel, and I became really interested in working in Waikiki and thinking about labor in Waikiki. And so this poem is based on that experience. I'm going to read it as it plays, won't be very long. Waikiki by night, step out to look at the moon. This is what you see. Reef of spent muscle, secretion of hope and work, ramparts, palisade, castles in the sand, palaces of purchased love, troves of stolen sleep. You hear the breathing of sleep, love, love's dark double, sleep's unsettled twin. In the sweep of waves, the pulse of expectation, you hear your own breath. So the work precedes the rustle of palms, the broom against the pavement, the pulse of the waves. The hand on the rake erases the day's footprints on Waikiki Beach. In frigid kitchens, in fluorescent corridors, all work is night work. When the tide sighs to traffic, from the state of verb to the state of thing, the sound of 1,000 hands waving and working. The hand approaches an act of deposition, passing you your glass. So I've always been interested in the intersection between poetic work, creative writing, and critical writing. So in putting this poem together, I wanted to integrate lines of my poem as quotations from works of criticism, works of philosophy that had to do with labor, ethics, and the colonial history of Hawaii. And so as you read through it, various points will open up these pages of quotations from different scholars and critics and artists. Sovereignty here has been lifted from the host, the threshold branded with invading names, the assailant's tracks and guard's blood, the thief's fingerprints on the night table. Now I lay me down to sleep, pliant accomplice. This is a quotation from Derrida on hospitality. I want to do one more thing before I stop. As I was writing this, there are many, many pages, and you read it through by following those links in order to read through the poem, but I wanted people to get to the end. And so I programmed it so that after a certain number of pages were read, it would jump to the very last screen. Ask me for the moon, send your face to meet my face, lend my breath, your name. Turn to face the moon, intimacy and distance, gravity and light. Will I welcome you? Will you shelter me? Will I shelter you? Will you welcome me? When the world belongs to us, the way the moon does? Okay. I showed that to you all because I wanted to emphasize that one of the best ways, I think, of getting to appreciate electronic literature is to make it, is to try your hand at learning a little bit of programming. There are a lot of open source, easy to use platforms for developing interactive fiction, for animating text. Making something, I think, is, as I said, the best way of understanding the aesthetics, the craft of putting these things together. I made that piece primarily to learn how to script so I could read other texts by other authors in a way that could take account of the algorithmic dimension. I could appreciate the craft that went into it, the strategies that went into it. And I think a lot of the work that I've published tries, in some cases, to quote the code to show how the programmer has created a particular kind of trope or figure. So that's it for me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, dear professor. Thank you for such an amazing intervention. I think that you explored the themes, all of the themes, and the questions that haunt discussion on electronic literature. So I suggest that we receive questions from students and then you respond back to them. Okay. So any your questions, please. The floor is open. Yes. Yes, please. Your questions.
Mourad, I'm not sure I can see the raise hand feature, but you'll just let me know.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So before you ask the question, make sure that you introduce yourself, please, and your research. What are you working on? Yes, please. Yes.
Well, do you remember the other piece you had them read?
Yeah, in
About
Arabic.
thinking
There
about
was a novel in Arabic.
A novel in Arabic.
Arabic,
And what
yes.
was the format?
It's a hyperlink novel.
Okay.
So you move from
So
one link, but at the same time, there is this intermedial like connection between different media. There is like from movies, from advertising, from the news, like from music. So when you read the novel, you move between the different media. It's very interesting, by the way, and it's written by the main like figure in Arabic electronic literature.
oh yeah,
His name is Muhammad Sanajila from Jordan.
from Jordan.
Muhammad Sanajila. He is very famous in the Arab world. And they have a website called Arab E-Writers. And he is like the president of this, like the founder of this website.
Okay, great.
It's called Arab E-Writers. If you Google it, you find it online now.
Yeah, thanks. I'm looking forward to looking. I mean, I can't read Arabic, unfortunately, but is any of it published in French?
Not many, like in Arabic, from Arab like speakers, not many.
Not many, yeah.
Yes, yeah. In English, yes. In English, there are some exceptions, like few examples. Yes, your questions, please.
Yes, Mourad.
Yes, Daudi.
This is
Professor
Daudi.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Mourad, for inviting me to attend this very, very illuminating and enlightening lecture by Professor John David. So John David, welcome and again, and thank you very much for
thank you.
The lecture you gave. And just the first thing, what time is it in the place where you are, John?
I'm currently in California, and it's 8 o'clock in the morning. It would be 5 o'clock in the morning.
Oh,
if I were in Hawaii.
I'm asking you this question just to let students know that principled academics and principled researchers have nothing to do with time, food, sleeping, or something like this.
I was at the comparative literature conference.
And for this, I thank you very much for this, Professor John. Now we are living in the age of transformation. Transformation of the book, transformation of the library, transformation of the librarian, and so on and so forth. So now the first question is the openness you talked about in the beginning of your as a principle in the electronic literature. So to what extent can we talk about meaning making in electronic text or electronic novel or electronic literary text? This is one thing. The second thing is now people say that the electronic text is less controlled if compared to the physical text or physical book. So what can we say about that? It's less authoritative, less controlled, and anything goes, as people say. Anything goes with electronic texts. Thank you.
Can you say something about what your perception is of what it means to be controlled? Because I think that's the key word in that question.
In terms of proofreading, of editing, of indexation. Okay.
Okay. So I guess I have answers to that. One that addresses electronic literature in particular, so artistic work in digital forms. And then a different one that has to do with electronic publishing, which is something I work in. In terms of literature, I have to disagree with that because it's true. I mean, it isn't true that a work of electronic literature is less controlled from the standpoint of the author than a work in print. In fact, control is in some ways even more essential, for writers like Brian Kim Steffens or Judd Morrissey or, other writers, because if they make a single mistake in the programming, it will not work. So a kind of care, a kind of attention to detail, a kind of control, you can't do without it. So, they're every bit as controlled, and maybe controlled on different levels, in different ways, than a work of print literature. One of the challenges, I think, in producing this work is that increasingly people are working in collaboration with each other. So Judd and Lori work together on My Name is Captain Captain, because you have people can check your work. A lot of these people are working alone. They're single authors. Nobody proofreads their work. I haven't found a huge amount of mistakes in the work that I've read. There are a few in The Jew's Daughter, that Dave Chicarico actually points out, that are just editing, proofreading problems. But I think what I would say about control in the case of electronic literature is it to a greater degree than a reader, from the reader's perspective, a greater degree than a reader of print, the reader of e-lit has more control, because they can make choices. They can choose different options for moving through the text. Now, those choices are always bounded. They're always controlled ultimately by the author, because you can't choose to do anything except not to read it, really. That's your only true choice, in any work of electronic literature. In terms of online publishing, yeah, I don't know what your attitude is about open source academic publishing. I work for a journal that is not open source, that's delivered through Project Muse. We do scrupulous proofreading in-house, and we're very proud that biography, it always has mistakes, but there are not many of them. But in reading a lot of work that's published in open source formats, I find it poorly edited, not well controlled. And I think that has to do with economics, as presses and universities take funding away from publishing initiatives like journals, people are saying, oh, let's go online. But that means that somebody has to work for free. The European Journal of Life Writing, which I greatly admire, works out of a library in Amsterdam, with one guy, putting it together. I don't know who edits it. It's wonderful work, but it doesn't have the same kind of, you can tell it hasn't been carefully edited. So I'm not sure that gets at your question, but I think as we make it easier to disseminate texts, we have to also be responsible about the quality of those texts, and, I have a fairly conservative position on open source publishing. I know it's important for a lot of scholars to be able to get their work out quickly, but I think there's a price to be paid for that.
Concerning the participation dimension, now the reader-writer pattern. Now there is a sort of participation. I call it a contract between the reader and the writer, because now there is gap filling. As Umberto Eco, the Italian scholar and critic, referred to the open text, and now this idea of meaning making, to what extent let's say, to what extent is it open? Okay, what extent? Okay, so this interaction and this reader-writer interaction, and okay, so
there was a great deal of excitement when hypertext came on the scene in the 90s, that somehow electronic literature was manifesting, literally, some of the insights of post-structuralism, that it was exploding the text, there was no author, there was a kind of infinite proliferation of meaning. And I think that was definitely something that dominated a lot of the early critical work, on this stuff. George Landau is somebody I'm thinking about in particular. As we've moved along, I think people have come to a different conclusion, that almost a misinterpretation of those theoretical models to say that something can materially instantiate deconstruction. You can go out and make a self-deconstructing text. You probably can, but that isn't the goal of a lot of electronic literature. I think if you want to read it, and it's easy to say, oh, this text you can move through this text in many ways. It's like Roland Barthes was one of the big, kind of theorists who was often invoked. You can do, I think it's called Mises, you can jump around in a text, and he says, that's a way we experience and get the pleasure out of the text. Yeah, that's true, but it's also true of print. So it's not like electronic literature is doing anything different. The challenge, I think, is to read ELIT on its own terms, but apply, those theoretical models, not to say, oh, this is just, a literal example of it, but to say, okay, this text is mobilizing language. It's making us think in a picture. It's dealing in binary oppositions. How can I read this text through, a structuralist, narratological, post-structuralist theoretical framework in a way that appreciates both what the verbal text is doing and this is the challenge, what the kinetic, interactive, behavioral, algorithmic dimensions of the text are doing. Can we read those dimensions within the same conceptual frameworks we have long applied to text in print? That, I think, is one of the big, important theoretical challenges, that ELIT poses.
Thank you.
Thank you so
The
much.
floor
Mr.
is
David.
students.
Yes. Yes, anyone? Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi.
Yes.
Hi.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good
So
Good
thank
afternoon.
you, Dr. David, for your insightful presentation. So my name is Junsi Monadil. I'm a PhD student, first year, supervised by Dr. Mourad El Fahli. So the title of my research topic is audiovisual translation, constraints and challenges in subtitling, cultural specific items in films or movies. So, so Doctor, you talked about it. It's a very interesting topic. You talked about the importance of literature. It invites us to imagine, to make active, movements, and it invites students to be open, to be more engaged and connected with the world. So we have moved from print-based forms to more insightful, interactive ways of reading. But we need to talk a little bit about the constraints and limitations of using digital gadgets in a particular context. So, for example, when we talk about the United States, digital use in the US is widely used across the country. So almost all kids are familiar with digital gadgets, are computer literate. And however, in Morocco, how can we implement digital literature in a Moroccan teaching context, bearing in mind that IT is barely used in classrooms due to different reasons. So there is lack of materials, especially in remote areas or rural areas. There also teachers need to be trained, as most teachers are still attached to the old methods of teaching literature. So so this is basically my question. Thank you.
It's a really important question. I mean, the pandemic has shown us in the United States that the penetration of digital resources is not as great as we thought it was. We have a lot of school children falling behind in rural and low-income areas. But I absolutely take your point. And as I said at the beginning, one of my complaints and one of other people's complaints about electronic literature is that it's not only fairly Euro-American centric, that it starts in the United States more or less, the UK, other places, It doesn't have a lot of diversity, in terms of languages or in terms of writers who are making it. As you say, it's not accessible to many people.
Yeah.
So one of the
Yes.
reasons that I still work in the area, I'm friends with most of the major critics and writers, but I haven't focused my attention on it because it has begun to, again, I appreciate it. I think it's really important, but there's a boutique dimension to it. There's a kind of elitism, within it, that I find a little troubling. And I would be interested in ways of democratizing